its secret was revealed when cleaning out the home of a deceased family member. Growing up, I always knew that my great-grandmother, though originally British, had proudly become a naturalized Canadian. To everyone who knew her, she was a unique figure, an enthusiastic amateur historian with a particular obsession for the Napoleonic Wars. Her fascination with that period was so intense that it colored much of what she did, from the books she read to the stories she told us as children. The first time I realized just how deeply this passion ran was during one of our many family gatherings. It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind where the air smells of fallen leaves and the sky is painted with shades of orange and pink as the sun dips below the horizon. We were all gathered around the fireplace in her cozy living room, the warmth of the flames and the crackling of the wood adding to the charm of the evening. I must have been around 10 years old, still young enough to be captivated by stories, but old enough to start questioning their truth. My great-grandmother, or Granny Ann as we all called her, sat in her favorite armchair, a worn but comfortable relic of another era. She was a petite woman with sharp blue eyes that seemed to twinkle with every word she spoke. Her silver hair was always neatly pinned up, and she had a way of making even the most mundane details sound like the most fascinating parts of history. That evening, as she often did, Granny Ann began recounting tales of Britain's war with Napoleon. She spoke with such fervor, her voice rising and falling like a skilled storyteller, drawing us all in. She told of battles and strategies, of heroes and villains, and of the immense impact the war had on Europe. But what always stood out to me, what made her stories truly unique, was the personal connection she claimed to have with those distant events. You see, Granny Ann had always maintained that our family was tangentially related to none other than the Duke of Wellington himself. This claim, though often met with skepticism, was something she fiercely believed in. According to her, the connection was through a cousin's marriage to the Duke's son's nephew, or some equally obscure and tenuous link. To a child like me, it sounded both bewildering and thrilling, like something out of a grand historical novel. But Granny Ann wasn't just content with telling us these stories, she lived. Her home was a testament to her passion. The walls were adorned with portraits of British generals, maps of battlefields, and shelves upon shelves of books detailing the Napoleonic Wars. There was even a glass case in the corner of her living room that housed various artifacts she had collected over the years. Medals, letters, and even a piece of a uniform that she claimed had once belonged to a soldier in Wellington's army. As I grew older, I began to understand that her interest wasn't merely a hobby. It was an obsession. She spent countless hours researching, writing letters to historians, and poring over dusty tomes in search of any new piece of information that could further solidify our supposed connection to the Duke. It was as if she was on a personal mission, not just to understand history, but to place herself and our family within it. I remember one summer when I was about 14, I was helping her organize some of her papers. She had boxes upon boxes of documents, old letters, and journals that she had meticulously collected over the years. As we worked, she started talking about a particular document she had been trying to obtain for years. A letter supposedly written by the Duke of Wellington to a distant relative of ours. According to her, this letter was the key to proving our connection once and for all. She had been corresponding with a historian in England who claimed to have seen the letter in a private collection. For years they had exchanged letters, and she had even traveled to England twice in an attempt to view the document. But each time, something had gone wrong. The letter was out on loan, the collection was closed for renovation, or the owner simply refused to allow her access. Yet she never gave up hope, always believing that one day she would get her hands on it. That summer, as we sorted through her papers, she pulled out a well-worn envelope. Inside was a letter from the historian, dated nearly a decade earlier, in which he described the contents of the letter she so desperately sought. As I read the historian's words, I could see the excitement in her eyes. It was as if the past was coming alive right there in her living room. When Granny Ann died, it was a bittersweet moment for the family. She had lived a long, full life, and we all knew she had been ready to go. Still, losing her left a void that was hard to fill. After the funeral, as we gathered at her house to sort through her belongings, we came across something none of us had ever expected. Tucked away in the attic, behind stacks of old boxes and forgotten furniture, was a large wooden trunk. It was an old, sturdy thing, its surface scarred by time and use. The trunk had always been there as far as any of us could remember, but none of us had ever thought to open it. It was as if it had become part of the house itself, an unremarkable piece of the scenery that blended into the background. But that day, curiosity got the better of us. My father, who had always been a bit more skeptical of Granny Anne's tales, was the one to pry open the lid. What we found inside took our breath away. The trunk was filled with papers, carefully organized into folders and notebooks, each labeled in Granny Anne's neat, precise handwriting. There were letters, journals, sketches, and, most astonishingly, interview transcripts. As we began to sift through the contents, it became clear that these were no ordinary documents. They were the result of years of research and interviews Granny Anne had conducted with people who had lived through the Napoleonic Wars. It seemed that, likely in preparation for a book she never wrote, Granny Anne had travelled across Europe as a young woman, interviewing dozens of elderly English, French, and Spanish veterans about their experiences during that turbulent time. The realization was both exhilarating and overwhelming. We had always known she was passionate about history, but we had never imagined she had gone to such lengths to document it firsthand. Among the papers were accounts from 3 actual survivors of the Battle of Waterloo. 2 of them were English, soldiers who had fought under Wellington's command. Their stories were vivid, filled with the kind of detail that only someone who had been there could provide. They spoke of the mud, the confusion, the relentless cannon fire, and the smell of gunpowder that hung heavy in the air. One of the veterans, a sergeant, recounted how he had watched as a friend was cut down by a French cuirassier's sabre, the memory still raw even after so many years. The 3rd survivor was French, a young officer at the time of the battle. His account was strikingly different from the English ones, marked by a sense of bitterness and disillusionment. He spoke of the chaos that had engulfed the French army in those final hours, of the retreat that turned into a rout, and of the despair that settled over the men as they realized the battle and the war was lost. Reading his words, I could almost feel his anguish, as if he were reliving that terrible day with every sentence. But it wasn't just the veterans of Waterloo who had shared their stories with Granny Anne. There was also an account from an aide-de-camp to Spanish General Francisco Javier Castaños. This man had been present at the Battle of Bailén in 1808, where Castaños had handed the Napoleonic army its first major defeat on the field. His description of the battle was nothing short of extraordinary. Of the intense heat, the dust that choked the air, and the relentless Spanish assault that eventually broke the French lines. He described how, in the aftermath, nearly 20,000 French troops had been captured, their once proud army shattered. As we read through these accounts, it became clear that Granny Anne had intended to write a book, one that would tell the stories of these men and their experiences during the Napoleonic Wars. But for reasons we would never know, she had never completed. Perhaps life had simply gotten in the way, or perhaps she had felt that the task was too daunting, that she could never do justice to the stories these men had shared. Whatever the reason, she had left behind a treasure trove of first-hand accounts, a window into a world that was long gone, but not forgotten. And as we continued to explore the contents of the trunk, we found even more surprises. There were letters from historians, thanking Granny Anne for sharing her research. There were notes and outlines, as if she had been planning the structure of her book. And there were photographs, faded and yellowed with age, of Granny Anne with some of the veterans she had interviewed, standing beside them with that same twinkle in her eye that I remembered so well. It was an astonishing discovery, one that made us see Granny Anne in a whole new light. She wasn't just an amateur historian, she was a dedicated researcher, a woman who had gone to extraordinary lengths to preserve the stories of the past. She had travelled across Europe, sought out these men, and listened to their stories, all in the hope of bringing their experiences to life for future generations. As we sat there in the attic, surrounded by her papers, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. Granny Anne had been more than just a storyteller. She had been a guardian of history, someone who understood the importance of preserving the past, not just for herself, but for all of us. Her passion, her dedication, and her love for history had left a legacy that we would carry with us for the rest of our lives. And though she had never written that book, in a way, she had done something even more remarkable. She had given us the stories, the memories, and the connections that tied us to the past. She had made history come alive, not just through her words, but through the lives of the people who had lived it. As we continued to sort through Granny Anne's possessions, the discovery of her trunk filled with historical documents was just the beginning. There was more to uncover, more layers to the story that none of us had ever expected. We thought we had seen it all: the interviews with veterans, the letters from historians, the unfinished outlines for a book she never wrote. But then we found the wooden egg crate. It was my mother who stumbled upon it almost by accident. We were in Granny Anne's bedroom, a place filled with memories and the comforting scent of lavender. The room was exactly as she had left it, everything in its proper place. Her iron-framed bed with its neatly made quilt took up most of the space. Underneath it, tucked away like a forgotten relic, was the egg crate. At first, it seemed unremarkable. Just an old wooden crate, dusty and worn with age. It looked like it had been there for decades, unnoticed and untouched. My mother pulled it out, expecting to find more of the usual bits and pieces of Granny Anne's life, and in a way, she did. The crate was filled with old calendars, some dating back to the 1940s, untested recipe clippings, and dog-eared copies of Family Circle magazine. It was a jumble of everyday items that had once been important to Granny Anne, but had long since lost their relevance. But beneath the stack of old magazines wrapped in a piece of faded cloth was something entirely different. It was a manuscript, nearly 300 pages thick, bound together with a simple ribbon. As my mother carefully lifted it out of the crate, we all gathered around, our curiosity piqued. The manuscript was a work of art in itself. Each page was filled with Granny Anne's elegant Spenserian handwriting, the ink still dark and crisp despite the passage of time. What struck us immediately was the sheer meticulousness of her work. The manuscript was organized into sections, each one devoted to a different set of military memoirs, all transcribed with painstaking care. And there was something else, something that made the manuscript even more remarkable. It was written in 3 languages: English, French, and Spanish. Granny Anne had been fluent in all 3, a skill she had rarely mentioned but which now revealed itself in the most unexpected way. The memoirs were laid out in parallel, each account presented in its original language, followed by Granny Anne's translation in her precise, flowing script. As we began to read through the manuscript, we realized that this was the culmination of all her years of research, the product of those interviews with elderly veterans and soldiers from 3 different nations. The memoirs were vivid and personal, filled with the raw emotions of men who had lived through one of the most tumultuous periods in European history. There were stories of battles, of comrades lost, and victories won, but also of the quieter moments, the waiting, the marching, the letters sent home that never received a reply. It was an incredible piece of work, a true labor of love. Granny Anne had taken the time to preserve these voices, to ensure that their stories would not be lost to the sands of time. And yet, she had never shared it with anyone, never mentioned it, even to those closest to her. It was as if she had completed this monumental task solely for herself, or perhaps for some future generation that might one day stumble upon it. For a while, we debated what to do with the manuscript. It was a precious family heirloom, a testament to Granny Anne's dedication and passion. But it was also a piece of history, something that deserved to be preserved and shared with the world. In the end, my parents made the decision to donate it to the Imperial War Museum in London. The day we packed the manuscript into a sturdy box and prepared it for shipping was a somber. We knew it was the right thing to do, that Granny Anne's work belonged in a place where it could be appreciated by historians and scholars. But there was also a sense of loss, as if we were saying goodbye to a part of her that we had only just discovered. My father, ever the pragmatist, reassured us that the manuscript would be in good hands, that it would be catalogued and stored safely in the museum's archives. "It's where it belongs," he said, trying to convince himself as much as the rest of us. But my mother couldn't help but voice the concern that had been nagging at all of us. "What if no one ever reads it?" she asked, her voice soft and filled with worry. The thought weighed heavily on us. The Imperial War Museum, with its vast collection of artifacts, documents, and relics from centuries of conflict, was an institution dedicated to preserving history. But it was also a place where countless items, no matter how valuable, were stored away in archives, rarely if ever seen by the public. The reality was that Granny Anne's manuscript, despite its significance, might never have human eyes laid on it again. We sent the manuscript off with a mixture of pride and sadness, knowing that we had done what Granny Anne would have wanted. But as the days turned into weeks and then months, the doubts lingered. We had given away a piece of our family's history, and while it was now part of something larger, we couldn't help but feel that it had also been lost in some way. In the years that followed, we often wondered about that manuscript. Did it ever make its way into the hands of a researcher, someone who would recognize its value and bring Granny Anne's work to light? Or did it remain in a dark, forgotten corner of the museum's archives, a hidden treasure waiting to be discovered? We would never know for sure. But what I've come to realize is that, in a way, it doesn't matter. Granny Anne's work was about more than just preserving history. It was about the connections she made, the lives she touched, and the passion she instilled in those around her. Whether or not her manuscript is ever read by another soul, it has already served its purpose. It inspired us, her family, to see history not as a series of dates and events, but as a living, breathing tapestry of stories and people. It reminded us that the past is never truly gone, as long as there are those who remember it, who pass it down to the next generation. And in that sense, Granny Anne's legacy lives on, not in the pages of her manuscript, but in the hearts and minds of those who knew her.